All right, welcome to the first arrivers. As I say every week around this time, apparently the door into the Zoom webinar is a single file door. So we're going to give it a moment for people to kind of file in, as well as those who are joining us at 3:31, 3:32, and we'll get started in just a moment. Alrighty, everybody, let's get started. I imagine we'll have some more people filter in, but you're all here to see the panel and not to see me do my intro. So I'm gonna get started with that, and then we'll turn it over. So welcome, hello, happy Friday, to everybody. Welcome to the Smart, Equitable Commonwealth, co-creating the society we want. My name is Dan O'Brien, and I'm the director of the Boston Area Research Initiative, or BARI, and this is our annual conference. This is the 8th week of the conference, and we have an exciting discussion today about supporting Greater Boston's youth. Now, a few announcements before I get to the panel. The podcasts for our first 7 panels are now available through Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and SoundCloud. This is also where you will find all future podcasts released each Friday, so be sure to subscribe. And also, last week we announced the third slate of panels with 3 panels and a week off for July 4th. And these are going to be leveraging the 2020 census equitably, which will be next week. Equity in education, an allied but distinct panel from this week's, the following, which ironically, or maybe intentionally, is going to be the Friday that schools would have been closing. And then 2 weeks later, after July 4th, will be solving Boston's traffic crisis. And we should be announcing slate 4, which will be the last slate, very shortly. So with that, one other reminder, and then I want to talk about today's panel. The conversation today is in the Q&A, which is open, and we are moderating that. Also, we are monitoring Twitter. You can tweet at us at BARI Boston, and you can also tweet hashtag BARI 2020, and that will be filtered into the Q&A as well. So turning to today's panel. Today's moderator, Tom Crohan, he is the VP and Counsel for Corporate Responsibility and Government Relations at John Hancock, where he has led investments in a variety of domains. This includes sustainability, communities, and employee engagement. And with the latter questions about communities and young people, really focusing on the way youth jobs work and how to support young people maturing into thriving members of society. And that is exactly the expertise that can help us think about the conversation we want to have today. Today's conversation, just to be clear, is not one about schools per se. We have people talking about schools, but we're not talking about MCAS scores. We're not talking about test outcomes, so on and so forth. That's for 2 weeks from now. Though it could touch on that at times. It's more about how we as a broader society, as a patchwork quilt of institutions, support young people of all backgrounds to develop personally and socio-emotionally to reach their full potential. So we have 4 great talks today and a fantastic moderator to lead us through that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom to take us through. So thank you, Tom.
Great. Thank you, Dan. Appreciate the opportunity to be joining all of you and on this Friday afternoon, close out the week. I think it's Friday. It's hard to remember which day it is now. And I'll apologize in advance. I've told them to be quiet, but I'm in a household with 3 young kids who are not as quiet as I often would like them to be. But we're doing okay, and I hope everybody else is doing okay and is healthy and safe from their homes. But it's great to be with you again for a panel that's, as Dan said, is grounded in supporting Boston's youth. And we have a great group of panelists who I'm going to quickly introduce because what they have to say is far more important than what I have to say. But as Dan referenced, John Hancock's got a long history of supporting youth, specifically a program that we're really proud of called MLK Scholars, which promotes summer jobs for Boston teens. And this year, as I think will be a general theme as we hear from panelists and as all of us are experiencing, is a difficult and challenging year. And so it's requiring all of us to get creative and flexible, but we're proud to be hiring 36 students at John Hancock to work virtually as I am doing now and all of our employees are doing, and another 582 in nonprofit organizations across the city of Boston. And I think what we're focused on at John Hancock, and ultimately what this conference and this conversation I expect will focus on is issues around equity, and Hancock's focus on fostering a healthier and more equitable Boston. And I'm sure a number of you, and I hope all of you, saw the mayor's announcement this morning where he called racism, named racism, a public health emergency. And I just want to call that out specifically. So he committed additional investments to combat economic and racial inequities centered on housing and food insecurity, food security, immigrant advancement, and human rights and mental health programs and trauma counseling, among other public health initiatives. And I think you'd agree it's great to see the city driving action with additional investments, but government alone is not going to solve the problems that we're facing. It's going to require all of us to rise up and lean in and ensure that organizations we represent are making tangible progress and tangible actions. So with that, I'm proud to introduce a leader in the space, Niall Fuentes, who's a college and career coordinator from the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, to talk about the Commonwealth's post-secondary early warning indicator system, which is a really important project for the state. So Niall, can you take it away?
Sure thing. Hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to do about a 5-hour training in 5 minutes. So bear with me. Again, my name is Niall Fuentes. I am a college career readiness coordinator. I work a lot with dropout prevention, early warning indicator system, which I'm going to go over quickly today, college access, kind of anything that's in that high school space. To Tom's point earlier, Dan's point, I'm going to probably talk more about that school house type thing than other folks are, but bear with me. So I'm Niall, and I'm a data evangelist. And the reason I like to say that is I strongly believe in the power of data to close gaps that kids have, opportunity, achievement gaps, to really help schools and districts make the best decisions they can for their kids. I am a strong believer in the use of information to do good things. I'm not going to read everything here, but you can kind of see this is kind of my thing. If we had more time, I'd talk about Lucretius and the nature of things and the importance of data and that type of thing. But really the point about this, and especially with everything that's going on now, closing these equity gaps, getting more kids into college, developing Black and Latino leaders is essential and critical. So we need to get more kids into college. So here's our challenge. We know that the workforce is increasingly becoming information-based, based on high levels of education. In fact, if you look at my quarterly fourth-place slide here, Georgetown University has done some really great research around all these jobs being created since the last recession have really required some type of college education. We know that there are deep gaps in college going patterns, particularly for Black, Latino, and economically disadvantaged kids when comparing this to students statewide. So in that way, we wanted to create a tool that could really help folks to help identify these kids and to do the right types of interventions. This is something called the waterfall. We have this available for every school in the Commonwealth and what's called a Success After High School DART, another data tool. I just want to kind of illustrate this in a way because I think this is helpful to look at kids in 9th grade together, kind of where their graduation is, where they enrolled in college, they enrolled in high school or college, college after high school, and did they return to college or persist for another year. You'll see here the enormous yawning gaps that we all know about. And in here you can see kind of leakage points. So this isn't the EWIS tool itself. It just gives you an idea of identifying what the issue is, what the problem is. We create all sorts of data tools for schools to use, and we put them in something called Edwin Analytics. Edwin Analytics is a data warehouse. In here, we grab all sorts of data that's reported to us from across the Commonwealth. Stuff from schools, stuff from the College Board like SATs. We use National Student Clearinghouse, which basically has every kid who goes on to college and where they went to college. And we marry all that data in with our local data we call SIMS, and information about all the kids that have attended Massachusetts public schools. Here's a list of some of the reports and what they look like that we might have in here. I'm going to focus on EWIS, which is our early warning indicator system. Just to kind of get you a really basic idea of what EWIS is, an early warning indicator system, for those of you who don't know, it's a predictive analytic. And I know, for example, Tom and working at John Hancock, it's a bank. They do this all the time. They do all sorts of modeling to kind of do some predictions about what's going to happen. All of us who have applied for a loan or a mortgage or a credit card know we have something called a credit score. A credit score is a predictive analytic. So what we've done for the 940,000 first through 12th graders is assign them a risk level based on a particular academic outcome. You'll see here on the left, I'm going to talk about the grade 10 to 12 ones and the college ones, but you can see here, so if you have a student who's in Massachusetts Public Schools grades 1 through 12, we've assigned a risk level based on all these different data points that we collect. Again, these predictions are made, flags or risk levels are basically the probability of something happening without intervention. So it's not a life sentence. It's not meant for you to track kids in a particular way. It's an indicator or a flag that lets you make really good interventions, look at different pieces of data to make decisions. So you can see here on the right-hand side, those are kind of the risk levels we set for kids. Low, moderate, and moderate is kind of almost a coin flip. High risk, it's anywhere from 10 to 25% of these kids will meet that milestone. That's a lot of kids that will not meet that milestone without intervention based on our algorithms and our modeling. You'll see for the post-secondary EWIS, which is what I'm talking about today, we're talking about kids enrolling in 2 or 4 year college. Are they ready? Meaning, are they academically ready to take courses without developmental or remedial education? And will they persist? What's the chance of them enrolling in a second year of post-secondary education after they attend college? We make this available to all schools and districts. Schools and districts decide who has access to both aggregate data and student level data, so they can really do planning for their kids. For post-secondary EWIS, they're going to want to think about things like FAFSA. Our kids, have kids completed their free application for federal student aid? Are they taking the right courses? This is a big thing I'm trying to work on, is how do we get more kids to take advanced coursework like early college, dual enrollment, AP and IB courses. We want kids to be academically prepared, so if they do go to college, that academics is not a barrier. If they're working on FAFSA, we're trying to make sure finances aren't a barrier. And there's other folks, I think you'll hear from other folks on the panel today that really talk about those social emotional pieces. That is not in EWIS, but certainly if you're using those data, you should take that into account. When we do these trainings, really talk about this cycle of inquiry. We want districts to be very thoughtful about how they use data. We want them to use the big data we're giving them. We want them to use local data, local testing, things that are happening. There's also this piece, particularly of school counselors, is what you know about your kids. And what we'll never find in big data is things that you know about your kids. You know who they hang around with, you know what neighborhood they are, you know if they're in Boys and Girls Club, and those things help to kind of help you to design interventions. This cycle of inquiry is pretty familiar to everyone. Everyone's seen this type of thing. We want educators to look at these data and all sorts of other data, think about the causes of risk. And this is where a lot of times you bring in your folks who say, I'm not good at data, and they really have a lot of ideas about what might be causing these issues. We know that there are underlying, there's underlying racism, classism, all the isms you can imagine affecting this. We like to ask schools to think about things that are within their control. Do kids have access to tutoring? Do kids have access to a mentor? Are they taking the right courses? Identifying those causes, then assign interventions, monitor them, and then you keep going. When you start talking to people about data who aren't data people, they don't realize that it never ends. There's not a time that you're done with this. So we want people to really think about how to use these data and all these other data together. How does it work? We'll be sending these slides out, I assume, but and for those of you who are not watching these slides, we really want to talk about this cycle of inquiry more and dig a little deeper. And then think of some examples. Think about in schools things that you're doing to help kids. In one school counselors found that a lot of their kids weren't taking a second year of foreign language. We recommend that in our recommended course of study, and for 4-year admissions, it's required in Massachusetts public colleges. We have people that track FAFSA completion. We also have a FAFSA tool in Edwin that folks can use to see if their kids have completed FAFSA. And we always ask them to combine this data again with things like student surveys, student voice, things that you're hearing from your first generation college kids, and really think about what those supports might look like. The next piece here is, we have an actual report that goes out. For those of you who can see the screen, this is a fake high school called High Needs High, and it gives you an idea of the number of students who are high risk, moderate, low risk. And if you see these magical blue links, you can click on this and see a list of the actual students who fall into that group. And that's really real important data is student level data and the decision making, and what you're doing to use that data is the most important piece. So you can really drill down and see individual student lists if you're a school or district with that type of access, and eventually see something like this, which is a student level report. In a student level report, you'll see the local identifiers, which include last name, first name, and what's called a SASID, which is an individual student identification number assigned by the state. You can click on that. If you clicked on that blue link around the SASID, it would actually give you a record of that individual student, which is kind of cool. And then in EWIS, because EWIS is based on all these different indicators we report, all the different variables are up top. So you can look at this, you can download this into Excel, you can bring it locally and kind of see all this different information about where are these kids, why is this kid at high risk of not doing these things? It might be because they are an English learner who has very low English proficiency. It might be that they didn't take a math course or something like that, or they're poorly in those courses. So this gives you an idea of how to do your planning, how to look at those kids, and how to design your interventions, both on all tiers. So sometimes it's for your whole school, sometimes it's what we call tier 2 interventions, which is small groups of kids, and there's tier 1 interventions, which are individual hardcore interventions for kids. An example of a tier 2 intervention might be something like Gear Up or other type of TRIO program, 100 Mails to College, places where kids can go and get the supports they need. And lastly, and then I'll turn it over, here's a list of all these different indicators that go into the EWIS model. Race, ethnicity, economically disadvantaged, those are just used for identification. A lot of times those affinity groups, if you would, let you organize your work. So for example, if I wanted to start 100 Mails to College program, I wanted to focus on my Latino males at English high school, I could do the type of disaggregations and find a group of those kids. All the rest of these are things that are under schools' control, things like attendance, behavior, and course performance. All these things are things that can be addressed in the school. We call it data and model to kind of make decisions about what school might look like. And again, I think that is about 7 minutes. And I turn it back over to the moderator.
Great, thanks, Niall. Well done. 7 minutes is impressive on a 5-hour presentation. So impressive. We'll come back to you with questions. I got a number of them, but appreciate the efficiency in which you provided the information. So I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. Jen Green, who's an associate professor in special education and a child clinical psychologist at Boston University, to talk about what is a really important topic in the moment today: when schools call on police, Boston police involvement in behavioral health crisis in Boston public schools. Jen.
Great, thank you, Tom, and thank you to BARI for the opportunity to engage in this discussion. I wanted to acknowledge my collaborators. I work with a team of students and volunteers at Boston University. My collaborator, Melissa Morabito at UMass Lowell, who's a criminology and justice studies professor. And we have partners at the Boston Police Department, Jenna Savage, and at Boston Public Schools, including Jill Batal, who will be speaking next, and Andrea Amador. And this project was funded by the BU Center for Innovation in Social Work and Health. So just a little bit of context for the work that we're doing. We know that there are high rates of unmet mental health need among youth, and that schools are one of the 2 primary settings in which youth receive mental health services. But we also know that schools have very limited mental health resources to provide those services. And just as one example, the American School Counselor Association recommends a student to counselor ratio of 250 students for every 1 school counselor, but nationally, our ratio is almost double that, and we're similar in Massachusetts. Boston's no different. In the 2017-18 school year, which is the year that we focus on in the data that I'm about to show you, there were 125 schools with approximately 55,000 students, And according to DESE, there were roughly 63 full-time school psychologists and 36 full-time school social workers. We also know that approximately 14 million students across the US attend schools that have a police officer on site, but no trained mental health staff at all. So no social workers or school psychologists or school counselors. And when schools have mental health resources that are too limited to address the needs of their student population, school staff will sometimes call upon police who are available to respond to behavioral health crises that occur on school sites. So some context in Boston, the Boston Police Department has a school police unit, which includes a small number of police officers who have been specifically trained to support youth and to collaborate with schools. And Boston Public Schools also employs about 75 Boston school police officers who are unarmed officers who are located within Boston schools. So we're in the process of conducting a series of studies designed to better understand calls from schools for police to help to respond to student behavioral health crises. And in the talk today, I'm specifically focused on the frequency of calls from schools for police services related to behavioral health and the distribution of those calls across time of day, day of the week, and month of the year. The data I'm going to show you are from 911 call records, and these are data from the 125 Boston school addresses. These include non-school related events, so the database that we have includes all calls that came from a school address, and that's regardless of whether or not it included a school community member. So if there was a car accident outside of a school address, that call might come from a school phone number, a school address, but wouldn't necessarily include students or any members of the school community. Our data are from the 2017-18 school year, and we're looking at call records just from September through June and only on school days. So we've excluded weekends and school holidays and school vacations. And the 911 call record data includes a pretty limited set of information. We have information about the location of the call and the date and the time of the call. And we have one code that was provided by the dispatcher who answered the call that they used to describe the nature of the call to the responding police officer. So in total, during the 2017-18 school year, there were 4,376 911 calls that came from Boston school addresses during the days that schools were in session. And this ranged from 0 from some school addresses to one school with 207 911 calls that came from that school address. And the median was 22 calls per school. When we looked at the most common type of dispatcher codes per calls, the most common reason that the dispatcher coded the call was an investigation. So this could be any investigation of a person or an item or a space. It's a pretty general code. There were also the second most common codes were abandoned, hang up, or silent calls that came from school addresses, and next were miscellaneous. But what we're really interested and focused on in our research are two of the call categories. One is for the category of emotionally disturbed person, or EDP, and that's the code that's used by dispatchers to describe a mental health or a behavioral health problem. And the other is assault or assault and battery. And the reason we're focused on these two is because we think that these are the two call categories that are most likely to be related to behavioral health services within schools. And just a reminder again that even if it's coded as an emotionally disturbed person by the dispatcher or an assault and battery, that doesn't necessarily mean that there were members of the school community who were involved. It means that that call came from a school address. This is the distribution of those calls related to emotionally disturbed person, or EDP, and assault by hour of the day. And what you can see here is that calls are pretty evenly distributed across hours of the day, and that they peak around 11 or 12 o'clock in the afternoon. And I put up that yellow box there to show the standard hours of the school day, which are about 7 to 3 o'clock. And you can see that there are no calls in the early morning and much fewer after school than during the school day. This chart shows the distribution of calls by day of the week, and here we're looking at the average number of calls per day. So you can see on the left side, the average number of calls to come in on Mondays for an EDP, or emotionally disturbed person, was 2.29 on a given Monday. And the trend that you can see here is that the number of calls coming in related to an EDP decreased over the course of the week, and the number of calls on Thursdays and Fridays was significantly lower than the number of calls on Mondays when we ran this in a regression model. And in contrast, the number of calls per day of week increased for assault calls. So they increased significantly from Monday through Friday for calls related to assaults. And finally, I have a chart here showing the distribution over the course of months of the year. And again, these are the average number of calls. It's actually per month of the year. And what you can see here is that calls decrease in the winter months and then increase again pretty markedly into the spring, and especially in the month of June. And that's a significant difference from when school started in September. So we're using this information to think about what trends in 911 calls tell us about the behavioral health needs of schools, and how these data can guide resource allocation when we think about the patterns of calls across school days, across school weeks, and across months of the year. I have our contact information there. I'm going to turn it over back to you, Tom, and to Jill.
Great. Thanks, Jen. That was excellent, and lots of questions, I'm sure. I have some. But I think a perfect segue to Dr. Jill Batal, who works within BPS as a school psychologist, and in many ways is going to talk through how they're addressing and working on solving some of the challenges that Dr. Green just highlighted. So Jill is going to give us an overview of their comprehensive behavioral health model and the outcomes they are seeing. Jill.
Great. Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Jen. Okay. A report commissioned by the Boston Public Health Commission in 2014 called The Health of Boston's Children indicated that 1 in 4 children in Boston have experienced at least one adverse childhood experience, or ACE. 1 in 10 have actually experienced 3 or more ACEs. And some of you might also be familiar with the CDC estimate that 1 in 5 youth across the country live with a mental health illness. This prevalence, which is not new, presents a compelling reason to fundamentally rethink how we support the social, emotional, and behavioral well-being within our community, and particularly for youth. The sad reality nationwide is that only 1/3 of youth with mental health disorders ever receive any treatment, and there remain increased barriers to accessing services among Black and Hispanic youth. Among the third of students who do actually receive services, over 1/3 of them do so within our school buildings. The comprehensive behavioral health model, The comprehensive behavioral health model was developed in partnership between Boston Public Schools, the Boston Children's Hospital, and UMass Boston. The CBHM provides a district-wide framework for the implementation of social, emotional, and behavioral supports within schools. It's a data-driven framework for the use of evidence-based services that are equitably accessed by all students in the Boston Public Schools. This is accomplished in partnership with principals, school staff, community agencies, students, and families. And just a quick note on semantics, we used the word behavioral health intentionally when we started this work to talk about the presence of well-being as opposed to just the absence of mental illness. So I am a school psychologist by training. I've had the pleasure of working within several BPS schools to support students, families, and school communities. But in my current role, I'm responsible for the research and the evaluation related to CBHM. So my job is to ensure that we're achieving those high quality and equitable behavioral health outcomes for students that we set out to. One of the tools that we've included in our model is a universal screener, which is a way to identify early, like Niall talked about, identify early those students who might need a little additional support around social, emotional, and behavioral health. This tool is not a diagnostic tool, but rather to connect students and families to services sooner and support early intervention and support. One of the benefits of our universal screener is the ability to look at not just externalizing or acting out concerns, but also internalizing or acting in concerns that might look more like anxiety and worry. Students at risk for internalizing can oftentimes go overlooked in schools because limited resources often are directed towards students with more extreme acting out concerns. One of our previous analyses that will be published soon illustrated that between fall 2013 and fall 2015, students who were identified to be at risk through the screener actually made really significant improvements and moved into a low risk category by the second year, and that improvement was sustained into the third year. And so we're really excited that our most recent analysis has replicated this trend for another cohort of students. So this is a really big project with lots of data, but I've chosen one highlight to share with you all today. So based on our universal screening data, the average BPS teacher in general reports higher levels of concern for students around these internalizing concerns. In the fall of 2017, 29% of students who were screened in our CBHM schools were identified with some level of risk based on their teachers' ratings. When we follow this group of 1,851 students over 3 years, we see that their risk level decreases into the low risk range by the fall of 2018, and that they maintain that low risk level into the fall of 2019. Some more good news is that we don't see huge gaps in this trend when we disaggregate our data by race. Our Asian students, who are less represented in this group of at-risk students, seems to be rated with less risk to begin with, and then improve at a greater rate over this 3-year time period. But aside from that group, outcomes for students in the other racial groups follow the same general trend of decreasing into the low risk range by the fall of 2018 and maintaining that low risk status into the fall of 2019. When we look at students with disabilities, we see that they generally had elevated levels of risk at the fall of 2017 than their peers who are not receiving special ed services. However, both groups show similar trends in improvement, and both groups on average had moved into the low risk range by 2019. As a district, we are proud of these outcomes that represent intentional work to improve school culture and climate across our city. This work is as complicated as it is critical, and we know that despite these positive outcomes, there's still much more work to be done. As Jen pointed out, BPS is much like the rest of the country in having limited staff with training in behavioral health actually present in our school for a full school day. We are fortunate to have so many community partners who support school climate and behavioral health within our schools, and CBHM provides a framework for coordinating all of these various players and services to best understand and meet our students' needs.
Great. Thank you, Jill. Excellent. We started with college and career, and we're going to end with early education until we jump into the Q&A, of course. So I've got the pleasure of introducing Dr. Fernanda Campbell, who's a data manager from the Boston Opportunity Agenda, who is going to present on the state of early education and care in Boston, examining across agency data collaboration. Fernanda. Fernanda, you may be on mute. I don't hear you, at least.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry for that. And let's go back to the first slide. So I'm Fernanda Campbell, and I will be presenting on behalf of the Boston Opportunity Agenda, which is led by Kristen Maxwell. Pratima Patil co-authored this report with me, and I will be presenting some key findings of the state of early education and care in Boston, a report that we published last year. The Boston Opportunity Agenda is a cradle to career. Sorry, my slide is not advancing. There you go. It's a cradle to career public-private partnership that works to change education for all residents of Boston. We do that work bringing people together. We are across agency collaboration, and we have in a data committee that informed the work for this report over 20 participants representing 12 agencies. And the premise for this report was that high quality early education and care affects all of us. And what is the context associated with this premise? Let me put a number, 99.3 billion. That's a big number. That's the contribution of the childcare industry and its support of other industries to the US economy. The COVID-19 pandemic is for sure showing to all of us the importance of this industry and how we need to rethink how we are funding and addressing the childcare industry. Investing early in our future is also key to improve outcomes throughout life. Dr. Heckman is a Nobel laureate economist from the University of Chicago, has showed to us that an investment of $1 in high quality early education and care programs brings to society a return of $13 over time. And that's due to reduced poverty rates, reduced school problems, health problems. Kids that are in high quality early childhood programs are setting the stage to have better school outcomes, to have higher wages, and to have better health throughout life. So using that context, we try to answer a few questions, and to link with the presentation of Neil, that we need robust data systems, and unfortunately for the early education and care system, we don't have that. So that's how this report was born. We wanted to know how many children 0 to 5 are in the city of Boston, and by neighborhood, are they in high quality child care, and is this care affordable? So some of the finds that are in our report, the first one is regarding to potential demand, and we used American Community Survey data 2017 to estimate the potential demand for childcare in the city, and that number for 0 to 5 was nearly 41,000 children. Nearly half of those were under the age of 2, and it's important to look at these 2 groups because care for children under the age of 2 is more expensive, and it's also more difficult to deliver with quality. In terms of supply, we identified 930 providers, and that brings the total capacity to nearly 26,500 seats. 62% of those were in the childcare industry, in center-based and in family-based care. Using those 2 sets of estimates, we computed gaps. The first one was the access gap. 35% of children in Boston in 2017 wouldn't have access to a seat in a licensed facility. That's over 14,000 children under the age 5 that would not have a seat. This gap is primarily driven by the 0 to 2-year-old group. And if we look at every single neighborhood of Boston, we had an access gap in that age group. For the age 3 to 5, 7 out of 15 neighborhoods had an access gap. In terms of quality now, and why we talked about quality, because kids that are in high quality early education and care programs have better outcomes in terms of social, emotional development and cognitive development. So they are probably more likely to be ready for school. At the city level, the quality gap was 74%. And I will repeat that number, 74% of children in Boston didn't have access to high quality seats. All neighborhoods had a quality gap. And again, this gap was driven by the 0 to 2. So in Back Bay, Beacon Hill, that gap was 30%, whereas in Rosendale, that was over 90%. 93% if we're only looking at infants and toddlers, and 54% when we're looking at 3 to 5 years old. And finally, the issue of affordability. Massachusetts is one of the most expensive states in America to have a kid in childcare, and Boston drives the way. We have federal guidelines, and many people would react like, that doesn't make sense, but families should not spend more than 10% of their annual income in childcare. Well, if we base our findings in those standards, care is unaffordable in every single neighborhood of Boston, especially for the 0 to 2 group. And it's a little over 10% for Back Bay and Beacon Hill, but it's above 50% for Roxbury and nearly 40% in East Boston. So thinking about these findings and in light of COVID, we are looking at our next steps. Our recommendations included develop an early childhood data ecosystem, as the previous presenters highlighted. If we don't have robust data, it's difficult to inform policies, it's difficult to drive change. And we had that problem before and we need to tackle it. We also need, before COVID, we need to increase supply and quality of seats, and now more than ever, because we are going to lose seats. The Centers for American Progress estimated that Massachusetts is going to lose at least 35% of its existing seats. So we had a problem that is now amplified, and recovery from this pandemic cannot ignore the importance of the early education and care sector for the economy to thrive. And with that, I finished this presentation, and please visit the Boston Opportunity Agenda to learn more about who we are, what we do, how you can engage with us, and to access the full report. Thank you.
Excellent. Fascinating. And if you want to put an exclamation point on issues around equity, those charts are should be damning for us all. And again, as I said at the beginning, lean in to think about how we can all rise up to solve it. And Fernanda, maybe I'll start with you, because I think you highlight so well where disruption is happening, and there was a gap and there was a problem 3 months ago, 3 years ago, but it's especially acute and has been highlighted in this COVID environment. So if you could expand on that, and I think I'm going to ask all of our panelists just to speak to, obviously the data and the presentations and the studies were all done in the pre-COVID environment. Just as you think about and reflect, Fernanda, I'll start with you about, if anything, I think the findings will just be worse and the gaps greater, but just interested if you could comment on kind of where we now are in the middle of COVID, but certainly the impacts are profound. Fernanda, do you mind commenting on that to start?
Yeah, and I would try to be brief, because that's our daily at the Boston Opportunity Agenda. That's what we've been talking about daily, the impact of COVID in this very fragile industry that we've observed before, and now it's just amplified. Everyone has being experienced the impacts of not having childcare during this pandemic. You either have kids, talking on the background, you're working with people that have kids. And when we think about going back, if we are not trying to solve the problem together, we are going to see even higher gaps. So we are trying to monitor what's happening. We're working with the Department of Early Education and Care to get numbers from right before the pandemic and to monitor what is going to happen with the reopening of the economy. And with the data, we hope to just partner with business and with government and other organizations and families to try to together solve the problem.
Fernanda, just a quick follow-up, and then Jill, I'm going to go to you with a similar question that I just asked Fernanda, but just as it relates to family, friends, kind of the network that in many cases fills in gaps. And I think for families on the line of poverty or in poverty, it's harder and harder to access, or harder and harder to lean on. I'm just interested in how you either captured that group in the previous study or how you think about it now, just family, friends as caregivers.
That's a great question. And we didn't include that information because it doesn't exist. So we tried to find it, but we couldn't. And the mayor's office is trying to get information to help us understanding what is happening in terms of not licensed care. But the report was focused on licensed providers, known family members that are providing care. During the pandemic, we are seeing that relying on family, friends, and neighbors may be an option that families are now considering because of the fear of sending their kids back to group care. And unfortunately, we don't have the data. And I want to emphasize that creating a data at the city level that brings together different layers will help us to better understand the factor, the needs, and to propose policies that will help everyone.
Thanks, Fernanda. Thanks for your leadership. Jill, just interested if you can comment on, in being in BPS, obviously tremendously disrupted, and everybody virtual, and some able to access education in a way that others are challenged by. Just interested in how you're navigating with the center being well-being, kind of how you're thinking about operating in this environment, and how are you operating in this environment?
Sure, it's a great question. I don't think this school year will be one that many of us forget. I think I'll borrow some of Fernanda's language in responding to this question. You talked about sort of supply and demand. Certainly all the changes that we've seen in the last year and the preparation that we are doing now for next year have increased our need. I mean, there's a lot more need for behavioral health services. And I don't say that to mean there's now an influx of mental health or mental illness, but really just adults and youth and families struggling with all of these new realities. So in terms of our demand, it's gone way up. Our supply, in terms of providers, I am proud of how our tapestry of providers has responded. So it is a complex tapestry, and we have a lot of different licenses, a lot of different employers, and we've worked really hard to pivot to a virtual format. So in other words, students who received services at school, whether they did so through a BPS employee or a partner, for the most part, those services are still happening in a virtual format, and those families have a point person and a connection. But we've also seen a big increase in the number of families reaching out for those supports as well. So continuing to find channels to increase our supply in terms of providers will be a challenge going into next school year. In Boston, we are really lucky to have this many community partners and this many interested agencies in supporting this work. But I think the complexity of having all of these people contributing is that we need good systems for coordination to make sure that we're really leveraging all the resources that are in our community. So that is definitely a lot of the conversations we're having now. Certainly across all areas of education, this has highlighted a lot of existing inequities that were already present in our system. So I am hopeful to the extent that this offers us an opportunity to kind of do things differently and take what we've learned that works from this, but bring it back into a school environment. Excellent.
I wrote down, I think you said at the beginning of your presentation, a fundamental rethinking of how you approach these issues. And I guess that is one of the opportunities of the current moment, is that there are big ideas needed to solve and get through these times. And so I think that is the opportunity for all of us to think about not just small or incremental change, but really fundamental change as the opportunity. Jen, I don't know if you articulated really well the challenge and the problem that we faced. And I think if anything, again, the theme is that the challenges are even bigger. I think maybe one of the interesting angles just to ask you to comment on is just how to access data this year in this environment. And I'm not suggesting you have a study that's active, but I expect that as somebody that engages in data, obviously tremendous disruption, any baselining for this year would be difficult. Just if you could comment a little bit about kind of how to navigate through some of those issues, or how you're thinking about them.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that is something that a lot of us are thinking about right now. And Jill didn't mention this specifically, but I know that it's something that Boston Public Schools is thinking about, and how to assess what students' needs are now and upon return in the fall. And so I've had conversations with some other school districts as well that are trying to figure out how in the fall they'll determine which students need more support and make sure that they're finding and reaching out to the students who are most in need. So I have worked with schools in the past, and a lot of schools have put into place like BPS, systematic screenings to identify the students who need support. And I think that's the direction that we absolutely need to be thinking about for the fall, is how we can be collecting data to help drive these decisions about service provision.
Jen, just a quick follow-up on your slides. The month-by-month slide where it heightened in May and June towards the end of the school year. Just interested in, I don't know if you did this analysis or can comment on it, but whether that lines up with outside of school calls on those issues. If, you know, we always generally hear about summer months picking up from a crime perspective. Just interested if that was consistent or if that was unique to the schools.
Yeah, exactly what you're saying is true. There's a good amount of data to show that crime rates decrease and rates of assault specifically decrease in the winter and then increase in the warmer summer months, and people are out more and it's hotter outside. And so when we look at crime data across the board and among adults, that's the pattern that we see. And as you're saying, it mirrors the pattern that we found here in BPS. And I know, I mean, Jill, you and I have spoken about how in schools, that's often something that we see is more challenges as the school year is coming to an end and we're transitioning into summer in general.
Great, thanks. Niall, I'm going to go to you if you can, just on, I got a question from one of the participants that I'll come back to you on, but just on this post-COVID environment as a data evangelist, kind of how you're thinking about data and this year's data specifically, but also importantly, interventions needing to look differently in this environment. And maybe picking up on a point Jill made with the resources Boston has versus some of the communities, obviously outside of Boston, that don't have those same networks and communities of care outside of the school systems. If you can take any piece of that, I'd be grateful.
Sure. And everything I was hearing, when I was hearing Jen talk, I'm like, yep. Our data systems are shot to hell this year because there's no in-person school from March to now. So we don't have MCAS, we don't have course grades are a little shady, you know, things that go into our modeling are not going to exist. Attendance is weird. So we have to readjust what that looks like for early warning indicators. It's going to look a lot different than it did in the past. We had everything down to a science, literally, and now we don't. So when Jen was talking about, you know, doing screenings and that type of thing, we're going to need to focus really on how you use the data you have, as far as us doing training with school districts, with school counselors, with administrators. That's kind of what I love to do anyway. If given the opportunity, I would love to work with schools and district teams around data. So that's something we're really going to focus on because we don't know what that looks like. And another really good point you just made is Boston does have great resources around college access. Success Boston, College Bound Doors. I'm going to miss somebody, so I shouldn't name them. A lot of whom are funded by the Boston Foundation. You have private philanthropy on top of your TRIO programs and that type of thing. There is no Fitchburg Foundation that can do that. There is no Leominster Foundation. These places that have large number of kids who are first generation kids don't have those opportunities. So we need to go into schools where we don't have resources and figure out how they can do their best planning to intervene with those kids with the existing resources they have. I don't have solutions for that. I mean, a lot of those are, you know, the money's not there and it's not going to be there. We're, you know, looking at state budgets, what that looks like, it's going to be disastrous. So we're going to have to lean on our private foundations like your own, who's done a lot of good work around this, and see what's happening. I don't think that answered the question. But.
No, definitely. Just a question from the participants while I have you, Niall. So Gifty asked, can you look at data for immigrant populations only? Are you able to evaluate immigrant populations across countries of origin?
So we don't have very good data about that reported to the state. We have an immigrant collection we do for the feds. Where your report is immigrant if you've been here 3 years. The data is terrible. I've seen kids that I know are immigrants, you know, at a school and seen the statewide data, and they are not immigrants. For country of origin, it used to be a open text. So if you were from Beni in the Dominican Republic, it might say Beni, it might say Santo Domingo, it might say Dominican Republic, it might say Dom Rep. There was no way of knowing where those kids are from. So we don't collect or report out that data. We can report out language data. We can report out their English learners. I encourage districts who are working with their data, because you can download an Excel from UWIS, to add columns of kids who are immigrants. And if you're really close to this, and I know you're not supposed to talk about this, but if kids are undocumented, That's an enormous piece of data. And if you're working with kids and you don't know that, and that's happened to me in the past when I was in school 100 years ago, where I didn't know they were undocumented. I didn't know they couldn't apply for FAFSA and stuff. That's important data that we're never going to have at the state, but it's important to have locally in your system once you download the stuff. So short answer, no.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to try to rapid fire some of these, knowing that we're getting short on time, and I'm just going to go to the audience and participant questions. And Jen, Jill, if not surprisingly, there's a question just around police in schools. And I think if we center the question just around well-being and how we can look after student well-being, and just ask you to comment, specifically on your experience, or more generally just as it relates to policy as districts and cities and towns are now grappling with some of these questions and how best to structure. Jen, you want to take that one? Jill, if you want to supplement.
Sure, I can start. The project that we're working on, our overarching goal is to reduce the need for police in schools. So we're looking at why and when people from schools are calling out to police for help. And we think that that provides us information about the behavioral health needs of students, about the demand, as Jill and Fernanda also were saying, and about the availability of support systems for students. So with this collaboration, we're really looking for ways to better understand the reasons behind those calls and what we might do to provide the resources within the schools that will reduce the need for schools to call out for additional support.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I would add, in BPS, we talk a lot about upstream prevention and trying to be upstream. And I think education is not different from other sectors in this reliance on emergency services when there isn't the prevention and the universal supports already in place. And so where we see demands on those emergency services, it's a public health call for us to put those preventative systems and supports in place.
Great, thanks. We're getting short on time. So Fernanda, I'm going to go to you with a question that you're not going to be able to answer quickly, but we'll ask it and you can try to tackle it quickly as best as you can. So generally, the question focuses on the workforce gets paid poorly, yet childcare generally is really expensive. And so trying to better understand where those costs are. And then an additional question just around, are there any efforts to transform the funding model, knowing that social distancing is going to be with us for some period of time? So again, big, broad questions, just anything that you might have to offer in response.
These are $1 million questions. That's what we are at the Boston Opportunity Agenda with our different partners trying to address now. So thinking about reopening, working with the state, work with local government organizations, parent leaders, what can we do creatively to address this problem with thinking about health, but also thinking about optimal development for children. There is no easy answer. And I think ultimately that's me personally, not necessarily the Boston Opportunity Agenda now, speaking like we will need to take some risks if we are going back. We will all need to accept that, because no one can really solve the conflicting, following all the health guidelines and following all the appropriate interactions to promote adequate social, emotional, and cognitive development. And in terms of the workforce and the funding model, we are also working with different partners to try to think, how can we best support the workforce that is, majority minority women trying to do their best to raise our kids. We need quality. We need them to be well paid if we want quality.
Yeah, great. Absolutely. I'm going to do a quick rapid fire and start with you, Niall, just go in the same order that we did, which in 30 seconds or less, if there was one thing you want this audience and participants to take away from the work that you're doing or that you anticipate wanting to do in the weeks and months ahead, can you offer it? And Niall, if you don't mind starting just by answering the question that I just saw pop up, just as it relates to how you anticipate districts using your data? I know when we connected, you indicated that guidance counselors were the heaviest users, but if you can quickly comment that, and then 30 seconds on what you want the key takeaway to be.
Most of my work has been with guidance counselors, or school counselors, excuse me, and assistant principals, folks of that nature. I want them to use data in a cycle of inquiry. I want them to poke holes in every assumption they possibly could have had. I want them to really build good opportunities for students based on that data. And I want to help train them and talk them through it. Again, in my last 10 seconds, data is our only way to equity. There's no other way around it. If you don't start looking and identifying where the issues are, you're not going to be able to solve those issues. Until then, we can hope and pray all we want.
Powerful. Thanks. Jen.
I agree with everything that Niall just said about data and the importance of data and including the data that we've been collecting with this partnership to try to understand the experiences of youth in schools and to illustrate the need for increased behavioral health services. And that is really something that's come across clearly in the work that we've been doing, is a need to support Boston Public Schools in increasing their supply of behavioral health providers and behavioral health services.
Thanks, Jen. Jill, 30 seconds or so.
Since Jen said that so beautifully, I will add to that and say partnerships and collaboration. I think a lot of our work has been so much stronger because we've been working with different types of organizations, different perspectives, and trying to make sense of data with a lot of different lenses on that data.
Excellent. Thanks. Fernanda.
We need a we mentality to solve this problem. We need collaboration. We need willingness from government, providers, families thinking about the childcare sector. No single agency or community or government can solve the problem. We need to come together to try to think how we're going to pay educators fairly and how we're going to support the needs of the most vulnerable families.
Excellent. Well, Dan, I'm going to turn it over to you. I think we're at time, and I'll just again express my appreciation to the panelists, to Dan and the team for allowing me the opportunity to participate in this session. And I come away inspired going into the weekend, hearing from the leaders that are driving meaningful change across early education all the way to college and career. So a big thank you, and look forward to continuing the opportunity to stay engaged in this dialogue to drive meaningful and measurable impact. So thank you very much. Dan, I'll go to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Tom. Thank you so much for joining us for this and for leading us through this conversation, which so important and so much to think about. Thank you, Jen, Jill, Fernanda, and Niall for the great presentations. Really enjoyed them. I know the audience did as well. Just really illuminating. And I don't want to take any more time except to say this is incredibly trenchant, right? And it's so nice to hear such consonant voices saying, right, this is about equity and this is about data in order to understand equity, and we have to solve this problem together, which is exactly what this whole conference and the conversations we've been having every week is all about. So thank you again for sharing the wonderful work. Thank you again, Tom, for taking the time to kind of bring it all together. And thank you to everyone who joined today to be part of this and joining for yet another week of the conference. As every week, we have a happy hour following this where people can chat a bit more about the work and the presentations and the conversation. It is at bit.ly/BARI, capital BARI, happy, lowercase, and there is a password. The password is BARI, capital BARI. And so for those who can't join us, thank you again. Have a great weekend. And for those who can join us, we look forward to seeing you there in a few minutes. Right. Thank you, everybody.
Are you going over? Oh.